The biggest problem for the British was that they were at war in two theatres simultaneously. This basically nullified the Singapore strategy, which was key to Britain's defence of its Asian interests. The Singapore strategy was formed with Britain's traditional naval strength in mind. It relied on the island fortress being able to hold out under siege for several weeks until reinforcements arrived via ship from Europe. This thinking had also shaped the island's defences, which were based entirely on preventing a seaborne attack. The failure to update the Singapore strategy to reflect the growing dominance of air power in modern warfare was also a major factor. With the British Isles themselves under siege from Germany, London could ill afford to send anything beyond the bare minimum to relieve Singapore. Most of the Royal Navy's ships, the Army's crack troops, and most importantly, the best airplanes were held back as they were needed to defend the homeland. This last point was to prove pivotal, as the strength of the Japanese Air Force had been vastly underestimated. The lack of modern aircraft stationed in Malaya and Singapore allowed the invaders to quickly gain control of the skies, an achievement that more or less sealed Singapore's fate. The British Army in Malaya and Singapore was a unique beast, comprising of troops from several nations fighting under a single banner while defending a place that the vast majority of them did not call home. Add to this that many of them were inexperienced and ill-equipped to fight jungle warfare, and the whole defence of Malaya and Singapore was a disaster waiting to happen. Early defeats on the battlefield only made things worse. Interforce rivalries and mutual mistrust quickly boiled to the surface. The Australians tended to blame the Indians when things went wrong, while the British were highly critical of the Aussies. And almost all the rank and file were unhappy with Malaya Command, while questions of the loyalties of some of the Indian units were also regularly aired. It was a vicious cycle. By the time hostilities reached Singapore, things were unravelling fast. Untrained reinforcements fresh off the boat were thrust into battle to make up the numbers due to earlier losses. Facing a battle-hardened and tenacious enemy, the end result was all too predictable. The mutual mistrust between the rank and file extended into the upper echelons of the defenders. Petty rivalries between the commanders contributed to poor decision-making and ineffective strategy. The commanding officers of the Allies were also too rigid in their thinking. They expected the Japanese to fight as they would, but Yamashita's forces didn't play by their rules. The belief that tanks would be no use in the jungle was soon dispelled by the Japanese, who used a mixture of conventional and guerrilla tactics to repeatedly outwit and outflank the defenders. The Allies' unwillingness to adapt to these new rules was their downfall. In addition, the comforting yet false notion that the Allies could reserve forces and retreat to Fortress Singapore to await reinforcements was seriously compromised by the lack of permanent defences in the island's north. It's fair to say that the British and the other Allies never really took the Japanese armed forces seriously. That was until they met them in battle. Pre-war, Western commanders were dismissive of Japan's military successes in China, while ridiculous rumours persisted about the supposed physical flaws of the Japanese. For example, that their eyes meant that they could not fight properly at night. The first large-scale battle of the Malaya campaign, an overwhelming victory for Japan at Jitra, meant that the Allies soon changed their minds. But by then, it was a case of too little, too late. Anyone familiar with the events of the fall of Singapore will have heard of the Malay Regiment's heroic stand here during the Battle of Pasir Panjang. But would more homegrown regiments have made a difference? It's hard to say because although it's an undoubted fact that those fighting to defend their homeland will fight harder, the overall strategic errors and early loss of air superiority would likely have led to defeat no matter how motivated the defenders. Another thing to consider was Britain's overall objective, because although it did need to defend Singapore, it also needed to maintain the conditions conducive to continued British rule after the conflict. With pro-independence sentiment growing in the colonies of Asia and Africa in the pre-war period, arming and training large numbers of the local populace did not align with Britain's long-term goals. Additionally, they were wary of Malaya's Chinese population, which, like China, was divided among the nationalists and the communists. The communists were a particular worry, given their anti-imperialist views. So, although arming the locals could have made a difference, as far as the British were concerned, the risks far outweighed the benefits. In summary, there was no single dominant factor that led to the fall of Singapore. It was more a product of several factors that, when combined with strategic mistakes and a dash of good old-fashioned arrogance, resulted in the perfect storm that the British, stripped of their traditional naval strength, had absolutely no hope of navigating.